And then we've got an excellent programme of speakers to join us for today's session. So just give it just a second and then we'll get started. My screen keeps jumping around. Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm just giving it just one more minute to let people join the Zoom, because I know sometimes that can take a second when you've been waiting to join a webinar. So I'll just give it a few more seconds and then I will introduce the session and get started. Okay, so I'm going to get started with this afternoon's session. Welcome to this session on approaches to land sea interactions in the European Atlantic and beyond. I'm Emma McKinley. I'm a research fellow at Cardiff University, and I'm absolutely so thrilled to be able to be part of this session and to be chairing such an excellent programme of speakers that we've got for this afternoon's theme. Some of the topics that we will be covering have already been brought up in the previous session on transboundary governance, and we've kind of already talked about the challenges of how we develop effective and sustainable ocean governance across national boundaries and different jurisdictions, and we explored some of those topics and those complexities in the session that's just happened earlier this morning. But in this session, we're going to look at that from a slightly more complicated perspective and think about the land-sea boundary and the complexities and the challenges and opportunities and risks of governing and managing those spaces across the land-sea interface. So as I said, we've got a great programme of speakers that we're really looking forward to hearing from, who'll give us examples from different case studies and from their experience and their research from across Europe and beyond. Just as a note, we will be recording the session, so if you want to share it afterwards, you can do that. And also, while we won't be asking for questions immediately after each speaker, we will have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So please do put your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box as the speakers are going. You don't need to wait until they're finished. Pop them in there as you go, and then I can direct them to the panel at the end of the session. So to try and make sure we've got as much time as possible for that discussion, that Q&A panel, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Marina Markovic, from the United Nations Environment Programme, PAPRAC, of the UNEP MAP programme. And she's going to be speaking to us about methodological guidelines to perform land-sea interface analysis within the Mediterranean context. So Marina, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you all for inviting to really this interesting conference. So allow me just to share my screen. Just a second. Oh my God, so sorry.
It's okay if you go to your display settings, so the next one along. Right,
sorry.
It's okay. If you go to display settings at the top of your screen, Marina, it should give you an option to switch your display, and you'll go to.
Yeah, but somehow it's not showing. It normally does. Oh my God.
Marina, try the right button on the mouse. Hide the presenter viewer.
Yeah, I'm trying. I'm trying to hide. Oh my God, I can't believe.
Marina, if you try display settings, you're just a next one, yeah, and then swap.
Yes, sorry.
And then if you just swap it over.
I think it's good now, right? Is it?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's great.
So sorry for this.
No, don't worry, no problem. We can see your screen and we can hear you perfectly. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thanks again for this invitation. And today I will be presenting to you the methodological guidance developed as part of the activities of the UNEP map in the Barcelona Convention. So in addition to myself, today with me is, or with us, it's Martina Bocci, one of the key authors of this methodological guidance for assessing the lengthy interactions. So actually these methodological guidance have been developed in the Mediterranean context, where we have a long history of ICZM and implementation of ICZM, where actually lengthy interactions are really the central focus of it. So some of the most important documents that are the basis for this assessment are, of course, protocol of the integrated coastal zone management and conceptual framework for marine spatial planning. Also, these guidance have been developed as a sort of taking some of the best practices also performed in other projects, but really they have been developed as part of the 2 EU-funded projects, Supreme and SIMWest-Med. So the main, let's say, objective of these guidance is really to provide some practical and operational tool to practitioners, to planners that can be used as part of the MSP process, but also some other processes. We were focusing on the Mediterranean, of course, and as part of the MSP and other planning practices in the Mediterranean, different countries are on the different, let's say, levels or maybe different stages of the implementation. So these guidance need to be quite adaptive to be able to be used by planners in the different stages. Also, it provides very clear and operational steps on how to do. It's composed of 14 steps that I will just show. And really the central part of it, and quite important part, is the stakeholder engagement, but like in any other planning practice. So this is how this approach looks like. Maybe looks complicated or complex with a lot of steps and going back and down, but actually it's quite, I would say, simple and straightforward. Actually, it is composed of 3 main, let's say, phases or parts. The first one in red is kind of stock taking. It goes from the broadest possible list of potential interactions that we can find either from sea to land or from land towards the sea. Then we identify the most important one for our area, and then we move to the second phase where we go into much more, let's say, detailed assessment of those selected interactions. And then based on that, we identify lengthy interactions, hotspot area, based on which actually we provide certain recommendations for the plan. So these kind of assessment should not be excluded from the planning process. It should be embedded in the planning process itself. So here we have some, let's say, explanation of different stages of the planning process where this assessment fits in. But of course, it's not just part of the MSP process. It can be part of some other processes, ICZM and the like. What we are quite happy about is that we developed kind of checklist tool in the form of Excel. So this is just a screenshot of the first sheet. Here you can see it has 4 different sheets to assess different types of interactions, let's say, and it really guides the evaluators or the assessment performers to each of these steps especially for the first phase. So it's in the form of Excel, and it proved to be quite useful tool. Later on, we can maybe discuss it or show it later on. So now I would just like to show you 3 different examples on where we tested this tool in 3 different, let's say, settings. So the first one is Malta, where we actually applied the tool as part of the process for revision of the strategic plan for the environment and development. It's actually their MSP that was prepared in 2015, but of course, having in mind that Malta is quite a small country with relatively big marine area, this strategic document takes into consideration both the terrestrial part and the land part. So of course, land interaction is quite the central element of their work. So it was quite an important part of this process, having the technical committee composed of really different authorities, both from land authorities and the sea, that were working together, compiling all kinds of data, doing the mapping, exercising, and providing the assessment, the evaluation of these interactions. So here in the table, you can see green, obviously positive, and some of the red, negative, that resulted in kind of mapping zones, identify the hotspot areas that are quite important for their plan, for their, let's say, revised plan. Obviously, these zones are some of the port areas, or areas where there are some conflicts between possible conflicts of tourism, protected areas, etc. Based on that, they prepared some preliminary, let's say, recommendations for the plan. The plan itself, or strategic document, is not it's not finished yet, so we don't have the final information on the final things that enter into the plan. Something completely different is in Italy. Italy being a quite bigger country with long coastline, and actually 3 marine areas where the plan is being prepared. Of course, we could not perform in-depth analysis of all the interactions for the entire coastline. So the strategic approach was a little bit different. The hotspot areas were preliminary identified, and then the assessment was done on these, let's say, identified hotspot areas with a more detailed analysis, quantified, let's say, or qualified assessment on the positive and the negative interactions. So also the process is not yet finished. So let's say this phase C is not yet finalized. And for the end, the Montenegrin case. So Montenegro is not yet part of the EU, but they are still working on the marine spatial plan. And Montenegro is actually being quite a small country, and all the maritime activities are actually performing in the very narrow marine areas. And practically, they are some kind of extension of the activities taking place on the land, or very much connected to it. So land sea interactions are really embedded in whatever the planning process on the sea involves. In this approach, we were putting much more emphasis on the mapping processes. Quite a lot of detailed mapping has been performed. So for each individual interactions regarding the nature, let's say, interactions or the activities, then these were some kind of combined, grouped based on its frequency, so that at the end we came up with the hotspot areas, with some areas with the highest intensity or frequency actually of different types of interactions. And we used all this information to, let's say, feed into the plan. And even more than these hotspot areas, quite important were these individual interactions that were the information on these interactions were used when developing some specific planning proposals to see on the compatibility of different activities or nature and different activities, and etc. So to conclude, we were quite happy to realize actually that these guidance were really, they fit for purpose and what we envisaged, so that in really different areas, different settings, these can be applied, but in really, how to say, not in the same way and not from the same step. So it's also quite, we're quite happy to know that the experience from ICZM was quite useful and also should be further used, especially in terms of integration of different stakeholders, different stakeholder groups, and in particular, what is extremely important in engaging authorities both from land and from the sea, and this is something that is really embedded in the ICZM process as such. Of course, this methodology requires a lot of information, a lot of data, but I would say that this is not something which is really a particular for this kind of assessment. Any planning process really requires a lot of information. The more information and the more data and more precise data you have, the better the results you will have. So this is the same with this assessment. So with this, I would like to conclude and apologize again for the intro, but yes, I'm here for any questions you may have. And of course, Martina, who is really one of the key authors of the methodology itself. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Marina. No apologies necessary at all. These things happen, and it would not be 2021 without some sort of tech glitch in a conference. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions for Marina, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll come to them in the discussion panel. Great to start the session with thinking about how we can actually map and track those land sea interactions and identify those hotspots, and thinking about what that means for how we move forward with marine spatial planning and sensible decision making for those coastal spaces that have such complexity. So it's brilliant to start the session with that, and a really, really fascinating project. Our second speaker of the session is Andrea Morf from Nodrego and the Gothenburg University. Apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly, Andrea. And Andrea is going to be speaking to us about integrating a land-sea interactions perspective into the Baltic Sea cross-border marine spatial planning process. So really looking forward to looking at a different geographical space. So Andrea, I'll hand over to you. I'll stay on so I can let you know that I can see your screen.
Thank you very much, Emma. And, thanks for inviting me to this conference. It is really fun to have a possibility to share beyond the Baltic Sea area. It is also one thing that I would like to say, I'm taking a step back in time, because now everything has advanced very much more. We are now at a stage where marine spatial plans have been submitted. And the Mediterranean is also exploding with activities, and the Atlantic and everywhere. So we are, so to say, from the Baltic Sea area probably have been a bit more pioneering, but I think the pioneering is not so much anymore in terms of marine spatial planning and coastal management, but it's more like the institutional development that has, so to say, been there for quite a while. And I would like to show you a little bit this, and also while I'm now trying to share my screen and see whether it works. I think it does, and I'm going to start my presentation. There. Can you see anything right now? Is there? It takes a little bit while to build up.
Yeah, we're just giving you a bit of time, letting it warm up. There you go. Yeah, perfect.
Great. So there's a little bit of a glitch because I'm on a Wi-Fi connection, but I hope it works. So integrating land interactions perspective into cross-border marine spatial planning in the Baltic Sea area, what have been the challenges and enablers according to Pan-Baltic scope, which ran from 2017 to 2019 and has been building a long chain of collaboration projects that already started in the early 2000s. and a few, so to say, key persons who have been driving this in HELCOM and in WASAB, who have been, so to say, the fathers and mothers of marine spatial planning in the Baltic Sea area. So thank you very much for the invitation. My name, as Emma already said, Andrea Morf. I'm also working at the Swedish Institute for the Marine Environment at Gothenburg University and trying to straddle Sweden and trying to straddle the Baltic Sea and the North Sea Skagerrak area. On behalf of my MSP researchers and of marine spatial planners from the Pan-Baltic Scope project, I would like to present you a few insights from this cross-border marine spatial planning process, developing linkages to coastal planning. And these we hope to be able to not just connect like the scientific discourse, but also the practical discourse, a little bit one. Our results are available in a case study report, lessons, stories, and ideas on how to integrate land interactions into MSP, shortly LSI, as part of a story map on the Finland, Åland, Sweden case. The link is there, and as a pilot plan and guidelines for coastal planning in Latvia. So please go to these places and search for more information, because there you get more what we actually have been doing also in terms of concrete things. They have also resulted in a master thesis in the Erasmus Mundus MSP program by Sarah Mahadeo. And those among you who have participated in the ICS Annual Science Conference, Session Q on Transboundary Ocean Governance, will recognize some of these slides. Here I try to be a bit more concrete about what we have been doing in casework in Pan-Baltic Scope project. So, like for example, the Irish Sea, Baltic Sea area is some kind of a pilot area for cross-border collaboration, also on MSP. And this has been driven by common interests to address both environmental and development issues, and not the least through the international organizations of HELCOM, the Helsinki Commission, and WASAB, visions and strategies around the Baltic Sea area. So why LSI? According to our literature analysis, even if integration may not always work well, interactions across the land-sea boundary are not new to planning and management, among others integral to coastal zone management, as Maria just has pointed out. And some of our planners, when we asked them at the beginning of our work, well, what is LSI? They said, oh, we have been doing this all these years, and others asked, oh, what is this? How should we work with that? So there was a very big span between the planners among what they were thinking about. And what we can see from our literature analysis and to our knowledge, it was coined by the European Union and its experts and included in the final MSP directive of 2014 to promote integration across the land-sea boundary, but avoid territorial sovereignty issues with member states. Because this was a reaction to criticism against the draft version of the MSP directive with requirement to link MSP and ICZM. And Sweden was among the states that were also protesting, how to say. So to promote the implementation of the directive, also a number of carrots were distributed. And here Pan-Baltic Scope has been one of those, and the first project where actually LSI was, so to say, required. So what has the Pan-Baltic Scope been? It was one of many development projects and included planning agencies, regional and research organizations, and hosted a special work package on land interactions. And how did we work with LSI in Pan-Baltic Scope? In the work package, our task was to see how LSI could be integrated into MSP. And asking the planners, we clustered their answers and realized that LSI and the interest in working with LSI can mean quite two different things, from the actual land-sea planning issues driving marine and coastal planning and management, to the institutional framework with necessary planning and management systems, the related processes and decisions and stakeholder involvement, and then of course the knowledge and methods and tools, and ideally well linked into a land-sea planning continuum, as other projects also have called this. And based on the literature analysis and discussing with the planners, Norregio developed this four-dimensional analytical framework, and we used it to analyze what we were doing in the project and reflect together with the planners on what are the challenges and enablers to actually work with all these four dimensions and not trying to keep things apart and not mixing them up, but linking them. And we have been working in 3 complementary cases. So one of the cases was in the, so to say, more Baltic Sea, upper Baltic Sea area, and around Finland and Sweden and Latvia, or between Estonia and Latvia, sorry, and then the third one was Germany. The planners decided what they needed to work with, and we researchers observed and facilitated systematic reflection and synthesis. And identifying common issues to work with was already a challenge in the scoping phase. And it was also this that led to 3 complementary cases and a couple of sub-cases within one case. And Germany made a desktop case because as a country, it has already a well-established coastal planning system, and we didn't need to go into a working case, so to say. So in the Gulf of Bothnia case, you can see it consists of an overall case between Sweden, Finland, and Åland, and then of a sub-case that is only including Finland and Åland. And between Sweden and Finland and Åland, it was also a bit more on a higher strategic level. But what we already saw here was that the partner organizations were at a different stage of institutional development and planning. Finland and Åland were just starting and needed to work with basic data, stakeholder mobilization, building institutions in a shared archipelago. And they had, for instance, issues about environmental quality and planned aquaculture areas, declining coastal fisheries, recreation, wind power. And whereas Sweden was already working with MSP for a while, and especially interested in the economic zone and connecting together to talking about the plans and trying to link data on fisheries, wind power, and environmental issues and so on. Moreover, all countries have different governance frameworks where the responsibilities vary between national, regional, local authorities. And Sweden and Latvia also had overlap in coastal waters. So this is something that is rather important and that showed to be sometimes also a bit complicated. So what about the Gulf of Bothnia case? What were the LSI challenges? Different planning systems, different planning status and timing, and stakeholders to mobilize, and quite a lot of stakeholders to mobilize, and knowledge to collect and share. In this case, stakeholder interaction was seen as important, but this is not an easy thing. In a Menti survey at one of the early cross-border meetings organized by the Gulf of Bothnia case in Pan-Baltic scope, stakeholder involvement was actually considered as both important but also requiring a lot of resources. And that's what the partners from Satakunta region and Åland, starting their MSP process, spent considerable time and resources on, mobilizing and informing coastal and marine stakeholders to provide their views on what is important through an online maptionary survey. Here you see some data. And this was then assembled into heat maps with different topics, including a conflict heat map. In Finland, also MSP for the economic zone is driven by the regional level, with here Satakunta region, where the regional government of Åland is responsible for the territorial waters only. And the Finnish planning team also developed a visualization model to discuss LSI in the form of a drawing, reaching from onshore to on the coast and the archipelago and offshore. Now my computer is doing some strange things, excuse me. It has just thrown me out of the presentation. Sorry, this is a. Can you see this? Can you still see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it. You're back now. Yeah.
Ah, great. Now it was how do you say an update request, which is entirely my control. Sorry for that.
No, you're fine, Andrew. You've probably got about 2 minutes left.
Okay. I'm continuing to the next case, the Riga Bay case. Where Latvian and Estonian planners wanted to mobilize and capacitate their municipalities to plan the coast and link with national MSP. Our findings include a broad range of challenges to integrate LSA into MSP, and they are systematized in the 4 dimensions in our report. Here are just a few examples. And some challenges and enablers are more Common to the initial phase of institutional development, we experienced a low awareness of LSI, lack of common definitions and unclear mandates to address them. Lack of knowledge and low stakeholder awareness were also observed. The first important general enabler was to clarify what LSI means and how it is addressed in the governance system. Project work with linking activities across boundaries through workshops, mapping exercises and knowledge sharing between stakeholders and planners made process-related enablers. Pilot projects and guidelines, such as the ones in the Riga Bay case, are also initial enablers, but more permanent capacity building is still needed. There are also more permanent challenges here, illustrated by the governance system dimension. These are related to capacity, mandate, institutional differences. They can also be addressed by a clearer mandate, by establishing contact points and cross-cutting forums for exchange. However, time, resources, and capacity for planning and stakeholder involvement also need to be there as general enablers. Moreover, LSI issues as such make good enablers, providing a driving force to engage with them. We have, so to say, put our recommendations into 6 different points. And also want to emphasize that LSI thinking needs to go both ways and include the atmosphere. And it is highly scale and place specific, but can also reach across all institutional scales. And we have summarized these key enablers into 6 recommendations, which I'm in that case not going to repeat, but coming directly to my conclusions. We also developed an institutional learning loop to help planners and managers to think about structured in this way. And finally, as also discussed at the ICS Annual Science Conference on transboundary ocean governance, many challenges and enablers are not unique to marine and coastal planning, but seem more generic for transboundary integration and multi-level governance. So there are lessons from there that might be relevant, and we might provide inspirations also into that discourse. And please stay tuned for the work of the ICS Working Group, Marine Planning, Coastal Zone Management, and their work on topic or terms of reference D, transboundary governance. Here we are presently discussing the term of equivalency in terms of coordinating measures across boundaries of borders, because the systems remain different. So I'm happy to discuss further, and I hope I haven't exploded my time too much. Sorry for the glaps, and I will stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You brought in a number of really important points around capacity building and the need to think about how we engage with stakeholders, and also what we do when, in cases when we're looking at transboundary, you know, where those priorities might differ in different places at different scales, and how we manage those when trying to develop cross-border assessments of land sea interactions and build those into cross-border marine spatial plans. Of course, they're going to differ in different social, geographical contexts, economic contexts. So some really important points being brought up in your talk. Thank you so much for that. Again, if anybody has any questions for Andrea, please pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll come to them in the discussion session. So now on to our 3rd speaker, who's Alice Guttard from the Cluster of Sustainability Transition. And Alice is going to be talking to us about Coastal, which is a collaborative land sea integration platform. So Alice, I'll hand over to you. I'll stay on so I can tell you that we can see your slides.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. Here we go. Good afternoon.
Perfect.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present the coastal framework as in order to analyze land sea interactions. So I just have to mention that the project is not directly related to marine spatial planning, but I think that the framework could be used for future marine spatial planning processes. So a very quick overview of the project. So the Coastal is a European project based on multi-actor collaboration of coastal and rural stakeholders and system dynamic modeling to formulate and evaluate business solutions and policy recommendations aimed at improving land sea synergies and coastal rural collaboration. So we are combining qualitative and quantitative approaches to better understand land sea interactions, as well as fostering cross-sectoral collaboration. So it is based on 6 multi-actor multi-actor lab, sorry, in 6 different countries across Europe, which are representative of the diversity of the European coastal areas. As for today, one case is particularly interesting because it's focused on the Charente River basin, which is on the French Atlantic coast. So we are based on the participative approach. So what we are doing is we have a different round of workshops. The first type of workshop that we have were like sectoral workshops. So we have 6 different sectoral workshops focusing on coastal and rural activities such as fisheries, agriculture, coastal tourism. And then in the next round of workshops, we invited the most relevant representative of the different sectors to have a cross-sectoral workshops. And the final type of workshop is an international workshop where we invited representative of the different groups from the different countries in order for them to exchange on their practices and their lesson learned within the project. So combining the participative approach, we use a system thinking approach in order to co-create a process where we use mental mapping and causal loop diagram to identify priorities issues as well as challenge and the main interactions within the LANCI system. So in each of the sectoral workshop, we had we developed the causal loop diagram. And in the next step, this sectoral causal loop diagram, they were combined into one single causal loop diagram in order to represent the LANCI social ecological system. And this combination was made through common variable that we had in the 6 different sectoral causal loop diagram. This causal loop diagram, so representing all the LANCI interactions in the coastal rural areas, were then presented to the local stakeholders in the multi-actor workshops for a validation process. And this qualitative analysis of LANCI interactions were then used as a basis to develop system dynamic models for quantitative analysis of the LANCI interactions. So during this first multi-actor workshop, we also asked the stakeholders to develop a common visions across sectors for their coastal areas, and these visions were like supported the definition of the different system dynamic model scopes. And these system dynamic models were also used to evaluate different policy alternatives by using key indicators. And then we had a second round of multi-actor workshop where we validate the system dynamic models that the scientific team developed. It was also used to visualize the evolutions of key indicators through numerical scenarios. So these scenarios were like showing the evolutions of key aspects of the system through like 50 to 100 years. And finally, we also had a session on trying to co-identify and short to long-term business and policy actions to support cross-sectoral synergies along the LANCI continuum. So this framework enable us to analyze LANCI interactions as well as to support potential synergetic actions across sectors. So these models for LANCI synergies, they were used to help identify important system transition as well as key LANCI interactions. We were able to use this model to compare potential business and policy decisions. And using those models with a strong stakeholder engagement approach, through this we are able to develop some potential strategic business and policy analysis aiming at improving LANCI synergies. And those strategic business roadmaps that are like co-developed with the local stakeholders, including local policymakers, will be able to be used by decision makers as a regional sustainable development plan across the land sea continuum. As an example, how it has been used in the Charente River Basin in the French Atlantic coast. So we were able to analyze the different feedback loop across sectors. So knowing that in this region we have a shellfish farming industry which is highly dependent on water quality and quantity. However, this water quality and quantity is depending on the upstream activities such as the agriculture, which impact both the quality and the quantity of water, as well as the tourism sectors across the coastal areas. So in order to try to identify some potential action to limit the impact of the upstream activities, for instance, for agriculture, it could be transitioning to a more sustainable practice, developing ecological, biological agriculture. But if we start changing the agricultural productions, then we directly impact the port activity, which is highly dependent on import-exports of cereal, for instance. So using these frameworks allow us to integrate the whole interactions between the land and the sea and identified where we could potentially interact, and if those interactions will produce the expected impact, either like through the short term, but also through long terms, meaning integrating potential feedback loop across sectors and key component of the system. So to conclude, the coastal approach, so in link of marine spatial planning, so it's using system thinking, allow us to have like a holistic approach to better understand the complex socio-ecological system at the land-sea interface. As well, it also allows us to harness local knowledge through a strong involvement of local stakeholders all throughout the process, using tools such as mind mapping, causal loop diagram, system dynamic models, allow us to qualitatively and quantitatively understand land-sea interactions, and also is a good way to help prioritize key land-sea interactions, and to know that the project will deliver land-sea interactions models within a toolbox in order to be able to replicate those models in other coastal regions. Other element to take into consideration is the system dynamic model, so can support prospective exercise for planning development of future activities on the coast and at sea. However, system dynamic models don't support spatial data, but instead we can still use spatial indicators within the system dynamic models. And SD models are also, like any marine spatial planning processes, dependent on availability of data. And to keep in mind, nevertheless, that system dynamic models can be challenging for non-modelers, so involving experts within when implement such a framework is highly recommended. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope that this kind of framework can be useful for marine spatial planning.
Thank you, Alice, so much for your presentation. I think very importantly, you got us to think away from coast and thinking about issues further upstream and taking a whole catchment kind of systems approach to thinking about what we mean by land-sea integration. And we're seeing that conversation happen more and more when we think about what's happening in our rivers and how those ultimately affect our coast and ocean spaces. So a really important kind of point to draw upon in this session, and really the inclusion of local voices as well. And I know that's come out through the other presentations this afternoon as well. So thank you so much for that conversation. And again, any questions for Alice, please put them in the Q&A box and we will come to them in the discussion panel, which will be happening after our fourth speaker. So I'd like to welcome Stephen Jay from the University of Liverpool, who is going to be speaking to us about investigating land-sea interactions in the Irish Sea and beyond. So welcome, Stephen, it's lovely to see you. Please give your screen share a go and I'll stay on to let you know that I can see your slides.
Okay, how's that looking?
Perfect.
Great, okay, well thank you, Emma. Well, first of all, I should apologise for not being the person that you should be listening to right now. This presentation should be being given by my colleague Hannah Jones, who's actually been doing the work on land-sea interactions for the SIMAtlantic project. Unfortunately, Hannah is rather unwell at the moment, so I stepped in a little bit at the last minute to be a very poor second for Hannah. So I will share some of the slides that she was going to show you as well and speak as best I can to them. But the kind of full outcome really of our work on this topic will be available in the project reports that we'll be putting on the SIMAtlantic website very soon. So please do have a look at those if you want to pick up on any of the issues that I'm going to quite briefly cover today. So we're talking here about investigating land-sea interactions in the Irish Sea and beyond. So this is more of a case study approach, though we've also been looking more generally at the whole question of land-sea interactions. Interestingly, there's a little switching a terminology. We're just hearing about land-sea integration, and land-sea interactions shares the same acronym, so there's potential for confusion there, but never mind. We know what we're talking about, and the two ideas are obviously very closely related. Here we go. Well, also what we've done is to come up with our own definition of land-sea interactions. Now, this is not really a new definition, it's based on previous definitions from other projects and literature generally. But what we try to do here is to synthesize some of the ideas that have been circulating into, well, what might be a helpful definition for others as well. So you can see we've got three little phrases here. First of all, interactions in which land-based natural phenomena or human activities have an influence or an impact on the marine environment, resources and activities. And then secondly, swapping that round really, and interactions, whoops, what's happened there? Has my presentation done something strange? Okay, that seems better again. And interactions in which marine natural phenomena or human activities have an influence or impact on the terrestrial environment, resources and activities. So we're looking, as we've already been covering, at these interactions across the land-sea interface, but these of course can involve natural phenomena or human activities or both. And they can go in two directions and be very much intermingled. And then thirdly, the influence of these phenomena and activities are not considered to be confined by economic, planning or national boundaries. And that's of course very important because straight away we're thinking about interactions and influences which stretch beyond our neat jurisdictional boundaries. And the images at the bottom there, I don't need to explain to you some of the interactions that might be illustrated by those, such as, well, agriculture, of course, is drawing on a marine resource, but is very much supplying urban markets, which are land-based. And there's the transfer of materials out to sea and then the produce back to land, which is involved there, just as one small example. We've also been drawing on this framework, which comes from previous work that we were involved in as part of the ESPON programme. ESPON is an interesting programme, also a European Commission funded programme, which is very much a planning programme and has traditionally been looking very much at terrestrial issues, but is also looking beyond the shoreline. And so it carried out one of its projects looking more specifically at marine economic opportunities as well. And so this also kind of presents an idea of land-sea interactions. And on the left-hand side, you can see those two circles, which again represent the interactions between socio-economic activities on the one hand and biogeochemical processes on the other. And the text just to the right of that, that long list, gives you again some examples, and there's a kind of spectrum there from the socio-economic at the top down to the biogeochemical at the bottom, so maritime transport at the top, algal bloom at the bottom, and there's lots of things listed there, and I'm sure more could be added as well. And on the right-hand side, you've got how that's reflected also in institutional or governance terms, because of course we have a whole host of agencies and government departments and all the rest of it, which are dealing with the terrestrial and the marine realms quite separately, but do sometimes overlap. And of course, planning is precisely one such governance institution, let's say, that does that. So we have planning authorities dealing with terrestrial planning at a municipality level very often, and then maritime spatial planning dealing with the sea, but often their actual geographical remit overlaps, particularly in the intertidal zone. And of course, there's a whole host of other agencies, particular to individual nations, which could be considered as well there as having this overlapping remit. And we've already seen, of course, how complex this governance arrangement can be. But somehow the two sides of this diagram have to come together, that the overlapping socioeconomic and biogeochemical aspects need to be taken into account by the overlapping terrestrial and marine governance arrangements. So in our project, we looked specifically at examples in the Irish Sea, and what we were interested in were methods of trying to analyse some of these land-sea interactions. And we looked at two methods, which I'm not going to attempt to present in any detail because I'm really not qualified to do that. But let me just point you in the direction of them. The first was value chain analysis, and I will say a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides, looking specifically at the example of offshore wind in the Irish Sea. And when I say the Irish Sea, by the way, we're looking more at the Irish side, so the Irish Republic and Northern Irish waters as well. And the second method was looking at BT Swift analysis. That stands for bow tie Swift analysis. Bow tie analysis was the original one, but bow tie Swift analysis is a slightly simpler version of what's quite a complex methodology. And the example that we were looking at there was shellfish aquaculture and climate change. Bow tie analysis generally is particularly interested in looking at scenarios of risk and how they might be addressed. So where you have a very high risk activity, how do you understand what's going on, what the pressures are that might produce risk and what the different outcomes might be. So it's quite an interesting methodology for trying to understand that. And aquaculture, as I say, was the example that we looked at, thinking particularly how it might be affected by climate change and consequent changes to the marine environment. And the two little images underneath there illustrate these two case studies. You can see on the left-hand side there, particularly for Southeast Ireland, how they're very ambitious plans to expand, we even get going with really, offshore wind energy there, represented by those purple blocks, and a little bit in Northern Ireland as well, very little in comparative terms. And on the right-hand side, you can see a map, and those of you who were in one of the sessions this morning may recognise this because Adele Boyd presented Carlingford Loch as an example of cross-border governance arrangements. And this is a shot of the same loch. So on the southwest side of the loch, that's Ireland, and on the northeast side of the loch, that's Northern Ireland. And there's cooperative governance arrangements in place there, which of course is the framework for trying to address some of the land-sea interactions in relation to, for example, aquaculture, and aquaculture sites are represented there. But as I say, do look at our forthcoming report if you're particularly interested in that one. But coming back to the value chain analysis example, we had a working group that was looking specifically at this. And in fact, the first thing they did was to decide on which sector they wanted to explore in depth. And they were the ones that decided offshore wind would be a good one. And you can see on the left-hand side there, the bullet points, why they thought that would be such a good issue to look at, because you've got these broad policy drivers that are very significant at the moment. So obviously climate change and trying to move towards net zero with the contribution from green energies such as offshore wind, energy security, so making energy production more localized and being less dependent on imported energy supplies, for example. And of course, again, transboundary working, particularly important in the Irish Sea, as again, we've already seen in one or two presentations today. So they went through various steps, which illustrated on the right-hand side. I don't need to go through that for you. But just to give you a little bit more flavour about what this method involves. You can see in this diagram here, there's these dark blue blocks, which represent the different stages of development of something like an offshore wind farm, or wind arrays, we might say, from development through to manufacturing assembly of the parts, of course, the transport of those parts, the turbines and the blades and so on, to ports from whence they can be shipped out into their location, installed, and then commissioned for use, and then of course a long period of operation and maintenance, and finally decommissioning. Now, the first thing to say, of course, is that value chain analysis is nothing new, and this has been carried out in many sectors, but generally, for very much land-based activities. So what we've done here is to highlight the fact that the same form of analysis is very relevant when it comes to offshore activities, and is particularly good for demonstrating the land-sea relationship of economic activities like this. Because of course, some of these stages take place very much on land. The planning and development happens in offices somewhere. The manufacture and assembly takes place in factories. Transport over land to ports, but then the focus switches to the sea as the parts are shipped out and installed, and then of course the energy production takes place out at sea, but is then supplying again markets on land. So it's a very nice example of precisely the kind of cycle, really, of activities that are going on here, straddling land and sea. But the point of value chain analysis is particularly to try to find out where value is added at each stage of this process. So, for example, as the production process is underway, then value is added from raw materials to parts and then to finished products. In other words, they increase in value as they go through this process. And then, of course, the wind farm itself generates value by producing electricity up till the end of its life. So the point of this is to try to identify the key points of added value and where those lie. One of the questions of interest to us is, how much of that is actually out at sea, because that illustrates then the importance of the maritime economy, perhaps, contributed by this particular sector. And it's a bit more complicated than that, because you can see at several of the stages here, there are links to other value chains, which I won't go into now, but just briefly to show, to point out under development, for example, as a whole value chain associated with research and development, or survey of the potential site for the wind array, and so on. So it's quite a complicated process to try to understand all of that, but one, again, which highlights the economic importance of marine resources and the maritime industry in this particular case, to wider economies. So, as I say, there's lots more I could say about that, but I would just move on to summarise some of the broader lessons that have come out of our work within the SIMAtlantic project on this topic. And some of these points have already been made very clear by the previous speakers. First of all, of course, land-sea interactions can be transboundary in their influences, we've made very clear, and that's been very, very apparent in the case of the Baltic, for example. But that does make them more difficult often to assess when it comes to maritime spatial planning, especially if you're trying to quantify some of the interactions as we have tried to demonstrate through the value chain analysis. The second point is there are different techniques for understanding land sea interactions, and well, I mentioned a couple of them already: bow tie analysis, value chain analysis, and perhaps more stakeholder-led approaches as well, which may not be so quantitative. Thirdly, there is no one-size-fits-all technique. If you're interested in trying to apply one of these methods, well, you need to take into account things like scale and spatial implications. And then fourthly, of course, everything comes back to climate change, which has the potential to increase the impacts of land sea interactions and really needs to be at the core of so much that we do. And on that note, I'll come to an end.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for jumping in at short notice. Please give our best to Hannah. I hope she is feeling better very soon. And as you said, your talk was a perfect way to summarize and bring together a lot of the key things that have come out of today's session around the complexities of land sea interactions and how we think about those from a marine spatial planning perspective, but also broader coastal and ocean governance, how we attribute value, how we understand where things are happening from, what's driving change, and of course, as we think about climate change and what that means for all of us in a coastal or ocean space, what does that mean for us in terms of the monitoring and evaluation that we do of our marine spatial plans and the decisions that we've made now, and how do we future-proof them so that they can respond to and adapt to climate change in the future? So really important points coming out of all of the talks this afternoon. So thank you all so much for that. I think what's been really interesting is that a lot of the points that have been made really reflect on some of the kind of final points that came out of the session before on transboundary governance. There's a lot of overlap between these two sessions. And Steve Fletcher in his talk, and I think when he was reflecting on in one of the questions, kind of said that we have an opportunity, if we really think aspirationally about marine spatial planning and what we're doing in an ocean governance perspective, to think, to broaden out what we mean by coast, to broaden out what we mean by ocean, and to transform the way we are governing these spaces so that they lead to multiple benefits across society. And I think some of what we've talked about, we think about a systems approach, and we think about adapting to climate change. That's kind of coming out in this session as well, which is really, really interesting for me to see as the chair. So thank you all for those really great thoughts. We've had some questions come in from our audience, so thank you so much to those. And I know our speakers have already started to answer those sneakily behind the scenes, but I'm still going to pose them to you all so that we can kind of hear those answers. But please do keep your questions coming in. We've got just under half an hour for discussion, so plenty of time hopefully to respond to these questions. I'm going to go to a question that was actually posed to Marina during your talk, but I think actually it probably is appropriate for everybody to perhaps reflect on this, because Marina, I know you've put a response in the Q&A box, but the question was, does the complex appearance of land sea interaction processes cause challenges for stakeholder engagement? And I guess my kind of interpretation is, does the complexity more generally of land sea interactions cause problems for stakeholder engagement, and what your experiences of that have been in your own projects or your own research? And Marina, I'll come to you first, but then I'll go around to all of our speakers to get a bit of a reflection on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Coming from the ICZM, let's say, background or experience, I can say we are somehow, I can't say get used to, but this is our usual stakeholder practice, because you never approach only stakeholders or engage stakeholders just on the land and those are on the sea, because these interactions were always embedded in this process. So this is something we usually do. So if you would consider MSP as a process that does not look at the land, of course, land sea interaction would add this complexity, but I think this should not be the case. As for our methodology, the particular one that we presented, I think it really requires some kind of guidance. So it's not, you just appear on the meeting and so on. So it really needs a little bit of guidance with stakeholders to guide you through the process, to channel the needs of the specific methodology and channel the discussions and so forth. So I would say it requires a little bit of support, but with that, I think the engagement is quite good. So I just mentioned in my answers 2 different examples. I think Malta was quite engaged, seen with a lot of institutions together with the experts, with PAPRAC, with all the experts involved. We did this quite together, so I think that was quite a good experience. But I have to say this pandemic situation and everything is making a lot of things complicated. So I think all the experiences with stakeholders that we did in the past year and a half, 2 years, where, you know, a lot of online discussions and so on, not always the best cases. But maybe Martina, she was quite involved in the processes of this particular methodology as well. Maybe she can also add something.
That's great. Thanks, Marina. I think we all feel your pain thinking about stakeholder engagement and communication and just speaking to each other over the last year and a half. It's definitely been a challenge. Martina, bring you in. Thanks.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm Martina Bocci from Tielica Consultancy based in Venice, Italy. And I had the pleasure to work together with Marina with this development of this methodology she presented. And I also participated in two test sites, actually in Malta and in Italy. Building on what Marina was saying, I would say that first of all, our testing sites involved administration, so not really the maritime stakeholders were engaged, but just the administration in charge or engaged, participating into the preparation of marine plans, which is, of course, a very limited sample of the larger arena of the real stakeholders. This is because of several reasons, mainly the stage of the process of MSP in the countries where we tested. So, you know, you go step by step. My impression was that the complexity of the methodology of the guidelines we presented was well received because at least this provided a proposed road towards the analysis of land-sea interaction. A quite articulated guideline is better than a white page. At least for the administrations and the planners that I got in touch with. And then in Malta, yes, the guidance and the possibility to do the process together and to experience the implementation of the methodology step by step is very positive. But also in the Italian case, where a team of experts prepared a sort of draft analysis based on the methodology, and then engaged the administration in the revision, in the checking of the results. Even there, I found a quite good answer, and it was well received, especially for the possibility to really integrate things together and have a common table of dialogue. So the stakeholders perceive the importance and the chance offered by land-sea interaction analysis within the process of MSP.
Thank you so much, Martina, for your insight. Andrea, yes, I was going to come to you next anyway, but you're all being very polite, putting your hands up. I love it.
Trying to, yes, thank you. I was actually also thinking in relation to this question, I mean, stakeholders, especially if we're talking about land-sea interactions, this is also about citizens. It is not just about the big marine stakeholders. It's about you and me and everyone. And how do you engage this? And in that sense, the complexity really becomes much bigger. And very many different uses, and you have more diffuse user groups like the recreation people, you have more organized users like maybe at least some kinds of fishermen, more localized like the wind power or the aquaculture sector, and how do you bring these together to the same table? And here I think this is very much about facilitation skills, about thinking things through, about the resources, making a good and transparent process, and process leadership and also process ownership by those organizations who are responsible. Like in Sweden, it's the municipalities who are responsible for the local planning, and the National Authority for Marine and Water Management for the national process. And here the county administrative boards have been something linking in between, while like in Åland, it's the regional board and the municipalities. And here there was actually some kind of a conflict when the local stakeholders revolted against the upper level planning and said, no, we don't want to have any higher level planning in our area. So in the end, the plan of the regional government of Åland stopped at the private ownership boundary, even if their actual authority would have been until the land sea boundary. So introducing like the normal users and introducing politics into that kind of processes makes it all of a sudden very complicated. You can talk very easily among experts, but if politicians come in and if every citizenship comes in, then you have to do it in a different way. And that would be very interesting to hear from my colleagues also what their experiences are with the normal citizens.
Thank you, Andrea, for bringing that in. That was such an important point. It's actually something that I wrote down during the talk about. We talk a lot about local stakeholders and local actors, but do we mean people? Do we mean civil society? And I know it's definitely a challenge in the UK about how we integrate and bring local communities into marine spatial planning. Because when I've gone to those meetings about consultations on our plans, it's people like me who live and breathe marine stuff every day. And how do we get those voices heard? And of course, there are efforts to engage hard to reach stakeholders and communities. But I would equally really love to hear reflections on that point from anybody who'd be willing to, if anybody's got any insights. Stephen, go ahead.
Actually, I'm still with the previous question, actually. I hope that's okay. You know, about the complexity of it all. But this does relate, I think, as well to the point that you're picking up on. I think Martin has asked me a similar question in the Q&A as well about, and I think those was involved in these kind of projects that we presented. We're perhaps guilty here of, you know, presenting the whole thing as just all so complicated, it's almost unmanageable. You know, particularly we're trying to look at every possible facet, for example, of land-sea interaction, and we sometimes come up with, you know, what are sometimes called horrendograms or horrendous diagrams, because try to pack so much in, you know, you just go dizzy looking at them. And to me, the answer is a little bit, I think, what I think Hannah and the others in the SIMAtlantic team are trying to do on the value chain analysis that I tried to present, is to look at a very discrete activity. And once you start to narrow it down, you know, to something much more specific in terms of a particular kind of activity or concern or issue, it does start to become a little bit more manageable and something that people can engage with. You know, so, you know, stakeholders and maybe, you know, wider communities as well, I don't know, who might be particularly interested, for example, in the economic opportunities, you know, for their town, that's something like offshore wind might present. So I think maybe we do need to come down, you know, to a much more practical, you know, a manageable level. I mean, that's not to discount all the ramifications of any one activity and all the connections to other things going on, but at least it's a starting point, you know, where people can get a grip on things and maybe engage a little bit more.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. I think you managed to answer kind of 3 questions in one there. So thank you very much for that. Alice, you've not reflected yet on the complexity and bringing in different stakeholders. What have you experienced through the coastal project?
So yeah, throughout the coastal project, we have a little different approach, let's say, because so first of all, it was really like focused on land-sea interactions, so a little bit less on planning, although this in the end came later. But we started by so sectoral engagement, so we focus on stakeholders from one sectors, and we had so the same methodology, so asking them to map the land-sea interaction through their own vision, so through their sectoral visions, and through this exercise within the workshops, they realized themselves that their own sectors was connected to some other sectors and some other parameters, let's say, and that sometimes their activity was impacting other activities. And so we had this exercise with the different sectors, and then inviting all of them and showing them the whole mapping, integrating each of their own visions, and so and in the end showing the whole interaction throughout sectors, allow them to better understand, of course, the complexity, but also how they are linked and how they impact other sectors. So it helped, let's say, raising awareness. And then on our side, the research team were able to kind of like simplify all these interactions. And then throughout the discussions where with everyone inside and starting from this mapping, like key element came out, let's say, and this is how we were able to kind of focus on few lengthy interactions and few key sectors that by taking up some actions on these like small elements could actually have a bigger impact over the whole system. So related to the stakeholder engagement itself, definitely we need to have a strong methodology and methods throughout the workshops. And obviously, if you have some facilitator with experience, it helps a lot, because throughout our teams, I mean, some had experience, some didn't have experience, and you could see that the result, weren't always, as let's say, developed, or I don't want to say good or bad, but it was a bit harder for certain teams. So it's very important to provide a very detailed guideline to support facilitators with the stakeholder engagement. And again, the idea of like within those workshops, or when you engage stakeholders, I mean, you ask them things, but you also need to give them back some result, and it needs to be like it's not a one way, it's two-way interactions, and like that, it's this way that you keep them engaged and interested in the project. And so within our project, we try to have this valuation and feedback, constant feedback process. And of course, not only with workshops, because out of like 4 years, you only have like 3 or maybe 4 workshops. So it's once a year, it's not enough. So you also need to keep them engaged and like, having relatively constant communication and to not, losing them at some point. This is, some kind of feedback from our experience.
That's great. Thank you so much, Alice. And actually, it kind of responds to a point that Andrea raised in the chat, which you'd asked me to bring up. And perhaps, Marina, this might be something that you were going to speak on anyway. I'll just kind of pose the question, and I'll come to you, Marina. And the question was, how do we keep people involved? How do we keep stakeholders engaged when these topics are quite complex? They can be time consuming. So Alice, when you were speaking, I was thinking about the need to really build in this time for relationship building, to build that trust and ensure that transparency and that engagement so that it's meaningful. And I think, Stephen, you said about you kind of bringing that to a sector or issue specific topic can be a way of making things a bit more tangible for people, and perhaps that's part of doing that. But I guess, my question was really, how do we keep people engaged? Because marine spatial planning processes, ocean governance processes, they're long, they're complicated, they're not going to go away. This is something we're going to have to keep doing. So how do we keep people engaged and not risk the drop off of those really crucial insights? And Marina, I'm going to come to you first, but of course, if you want to reflect on the previous question, please do. It's just, I know you've got your hand up. And then I'll come back around the room.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's partly related to what you just mentioned, but also it's related to the comment that just appeared, Andrea's comment about involvement of citizens and actually these live meetings. I think in this past couple of years, there has been a tendency to say, oh yeah, we have these online tools and then they can substitute. And I mean, this is all correct, but really to some point. When we start to speak about planning processes, I think without live meetings, it's really difficult. I mean, we can have meetings with experts, small groups online and so on, but really if you want engagement of stakeholders, of the broad stakeholders, if you really want to discuss issues of the plan, it's so difficult. I would say almost impossible to do it online, or really to a limited extent without the real impact and real results. So I would really like to emphasize this, as we tend to forget, you know, we think, okay, no more traveling, we don't need this anymore, no live meetings, but I think it's crucial. At least this is my experience. Thank you.
I don't think you'll be alone in thinking that we're all desperate to go back to some sort of in-person meeting. I've got my first in-person meeting in a couple of weeks. I'm very excited. But I agree. I think you can't underestimate the value of that relationship building, and the fact that you have those side conversations and meetings, and the opportunity for much more organic and fluid conversation that happens. It's much harder to do that in this situation, particularly if people aren't used to using these sorts of platforms. I think we, you know, those of us in this kind of sector, we've become quite familiar with jumping on Zoom calls and having quite like deep conversations, but that's not going to be the case in every sector and every audience. So I think it's really important to bring us back to that. Andrea, you posed that question or that point. Is there anything that you wanted to reflect on that?
Yes. Yeah. What I have been also thinking is, how can you I mean, this is something that has to somehow be clustered, and as Stephen was saying earlier, that you have to start somewhere, and you have to start in the concrete, and that's where you get the people. You have to be in the place. And here I find also a lot of inspiration in the water co-governance work, and also in development work, where people have been working with participatory methods on site. And in that sense, the corona crisis has made things very difficult to be on site, but at the same time we can actually be outside and do things out there and look at the coastal landscapes together. So in that sense, it is not entirely impossible. And I also think I wouldn't throw away throw out the digital communication as well, because it has been very valuable, for instance, to collect local knowledge through Maptionary in the Finnish and Åland case, and have a possibility to link in distance people or individuals into bigger meetings to have them at least do a presentation or so. But we have to be open and creative to, so to say, combine the different tools and the widened toolbox that we have now into even better processes, and have maybe the small clusters that meet in person and the bigger ones that meet digitally, or have one big conference and then divide it up. This is also something that we have to learn as process facilitators, to even more aptly use these different kinds of tools. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. I completely agree. I think we've got to think about how we can move forward in this kind of hybrid way, and how we can use the opportunities and the benefits of some of the things that have happened over the last year and a half to our advantage, to ensure that we are engaging with, because some communities will engage better in digital format and others won't. So I think that's a really important point to make. I really thank you very much. I'm just going to go back to the questions, because I know they've been answered. There was one question from Luke Smith. Thank you, Luke. I'm sorry it's taken us a while to get to this question, but it was, do you think considering land-sea interaction processes in marine spatial planning helps to promote cross-border collaboration? And we've seen a lot of examples of cross-border projects in this session. So I'd really like to hear your reflections on whether that can, you know, I suppose the opportunities and challenges of that for that kind of transboundary cooperation and collaboration. As we said, there's been quite a lot of overlap between those two sessions. So your thoughts on that? Andrea, I saw that you responded lots in the question box, but if you've got anything that you want to immediately reflect on, and then I'll come back around the room.
I think it's better to play the ball to the others, and then I can add my comments in the end.
Okay, no problem. Would anybody like to come in on that point first around cross-border collaboration and the opportunities that land-sea interactions might have to support or hinder that? Silent.
But,
Stephen.
Sorry?
I'm going to Stephen first, and then Martina,
yes.
I'll come to you.
No, please ask Martina first, because I was going to open a slightly different direction.
Okay, I'm going to come to Martina first then.
Okay, I think I can bring the experience from the Northern Adriatic area, where long-term environmental studies have been shared between Italy and Slovenia concerning land-sea interactions in terms of effects of the river Pos and the other rivers in the Northern Adriatic in impacting and determining the conditions of the shared northern environment in Adriatic Sea and the fishing activities there and other things. So I think that land-sea interaction, common experience of analysis, of data gathering, of process understanding really set there the basis for an easier dialogue under MSP, which is starting. It has started with projects from years, and now is proceeding within the formal process of consultation. But people know each other, people share data, people share knowledge about the processes, and this is coming from an experience of land-sea interaction common analysis, at least for environmental related and biology and ecology related topics, but also building on these, considering relationship and interactions regarding economic sectors.
That's great. Thank you so much. Andrea, I'll come to you.
Yes, unless Stephen wants to add to the topic, but otherwise, okay. I think this is something that is really, I recognize that if you want to collaborate across borders, you first need to share knowledge and exploring the problem together. I mean, first you need to recognize that you have a common problem. And if the problem is not considered to be the same, you first have to actually find out what it is and who is responsible and who can actually address it, because the mandate issue is also pretty important. But at the same time, like the sharing of knowledge is like a basic step. And if you cannot really share knowledge, or if it's too different, or if there's no knowledge, you end up just discussing things, but not really being able to continue working. So in that sense, I think that's really, really important to have a common knowledge base that everyone trusts, and also to have the resources and the capacity to produce this. And here I think the European Union and all these Interreg and Maritime Fisheries Fund projects have been really, really important. In the Baltic Sea area, I can also say that actually the national states have also provided resources, and there has been some other actors like VASAB and HELCOM who have driven this and who have an integrative perspective, a little bit more environmental at the HELCOM and a little bit more planning from planning and regional development in the VASAB case. But at the same time, this also has to come from the bottom, from the municipalities or those who are responsible for coastal planning, and also from the actors, and they have so different perspectives. So we're still learning how to put things together, and I think we're getting better. Just this conference shows me that we are developing. But there's still a way to go, and but there's also other areas like, as I said, water management and rural development, where we can get a lot of inspiration and not have to reinvent the wheel, but just take the stuff and reapply it, and conservation management as well. Yes, I lower my hand now.
It's okay, thank you. Alice, I wanted to come to you on that point, because the systems approach that your project has taken must mean that you're looking at whole catchments which will cross different boundary areas and cross national and jurisdictional borders. What's your feeling in terms, about how understanding and assessing land-sea interactions can help with that cross-border, cross-boundary collaboration?
I'm questioning myself, being honest, because we didn't have any transboundary cases within our project, and I agree. I mean, with what Andrea was saying about sharing knowledge. So this would be a really good base. Obviously, it add an additional complexity to the already complex land-sea interaction. So it can be different languages also and different type of data. So I would say the add complexity more than maybe facilitate, you know, the understanding of land sea interactions. So I would probably rather go towards analysis, identification, and understanding of land sea and interactions by countries, and then combining the results in the next steps. But yeah, in order to maybe, yes, simplify it and already gathering data. And yeah, that's my reflection on this. I don't know what the other would say towards such a kind of approach, but then I guess it depends also of like the history in terms of collaboration, and if there is like, yeah, previous project, as like Martina was saying, previous analysis. If there is none yet, I might add the complexity.
Of course, absolutely. Stephen, we have probably about 90 seconds left in the session, so I'm going to come to you before I close.
Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, just on the cross-border issue, I would point again to the Carlingford Loch example in Ireland and Northern Ireland, where you can't have one approach to agriculture management on one side of the estuary and another on the other side. But Luke's question also raised the issue about how an MSP process can formally integrate land-sea integration. And as my parting shot, I would just like to mention the Marine Management Organisation. That's a statutory body for MSP in England. Seascape is a very important part of that, and carrying out seascape characterisation, because that really does knit together the land and the sea. And it's also a very good way of engaging with local communities to say, okay, what's really important to you about your coastline, for example? You know, what's the aesthetic and the cultural and the economic and the environmental issues that you think really matter here? And they inevitably cross land and sea. So that's one method, at least, that can be built in, it can be built formally into an MSP process that might help us here. On that, I will stop.
I think that's a perfect way to end the session, actually, Stephen. I think that kind of brings us back to the point I was making that Steve Fletcher had made around the opportunity of MSP to be this transformational mechanism and transformational process if we use it sensibly and we use it to do that kind of assessment. And I'm always a fan of saying we should have some more marine social sciences and seascape assessment in any kind of assessment. So big up for that at the very end. Thank you to all of our speakers for having such a fascinating insight into the complexities of land-sea interactions and really thinking about it from really different perspectives. I really like that we've talked about it from cross borders and cross boundaries, but also thinking about it from a systems approach. And also, Stephen, the stuff that you brought in about the value chain and the fact that we perhaps need to reimagine what we mean and what we, I guess, the scale of what we're talking about when we think about land-sea interactions, that we're not necessarily talking about a narrow definition of coast, that we maybe need to redefine what we are talking about to ensure that we're really effectively thinking about that within our decision making and our management structures, and thinking about that, what that means for revisions of marine spatial plans and the future of marine spatial plans going forward. So thank you to all of our speakers. Oscar, thank you for being such a great host, and thank you for contributing to the SIMAtlantic conference. It's been a fascinating session, and thank you to our attendees for some really great questions. All it stands for me to is to hand over to Oscar to end the session. Thank you all very much.
Just to reiterate your point, thank you everyone so much. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic panel discussion. And please remember to join us for the closing session, where we'll be going over sort of summarising all the parallel sessions and going over the final words from the SIMAtlantic conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you as well, Emma.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.